Just a couple of quick notes on the assignment that's due tomorrow at midnight. The first writing assignment is due. I got two good questions this morning about what you need to be looking at. So the first good question was, which chapters of the Grinnell are relevant to the writing assignment? And it's chapters 1, 2, and 3. So just chapters 1, 2, and 3. We do not expect you to read anything beyond that. 4, 5, and 6 are enlightening, illuminating, and entertaining. I recommend them in your spare time, but for the purposes of this class, just 1, 2, and 3. The second good question I got was about the midterm, and that was which lectures are potentially on the midterm, and the answer is all of them up until right before the midterm. So even the lecture on, the midterm is on Wednesday, and even the lecture on Monday is potentially on the midterm. This class is so lecture heavy that I can't just say, well, don't worry about, like 12% of the class or something like that. So there's that. I hope the writing assignments are going okay. Oh, one more point on the writing assignment. So I've asked the TA to give you numerical marks on each of the 4 questions, one for quality of understanding and one for quality of writing. I've decided that the quality of understanding will be out of 5, and the quality of writing will be out of 2. So that's the relative weight of those 2 components of that mark. Quality of writing should be fairly easy to top out on, like if you're writing sensible sentences that make sense and are clear and are brief, that will get you the 2 out of 2. Quality of understanding will probably be harder to top out on, but not impossible. I expect the average on that will be fairly high. So, just on quality of writing, I strongly recommend that you do not go to the verbose end of things. So in a lot of parts of the world, if somebody just uses big words, that's impressive enough to make people think they know what they're talking about. This is not one of those parts of the world. Using clear, simple language is a much better strategy than using incredibly complex language, at least partly because you won't have enough space to explain all of the terms that you're using. So if you use the word ideology, I'm not clear on, I'm not necessarily clear whether you know what that word is supposed to mean. If you use ideology and really you could have used the word idea, then you're just leaving a little gap in whether we're confident that you know what the words you're using mean. So simpler is better. The better strategy is to use the simplest language that clearly conveys what you're talking about. This is different than a lot of places where highly elaborate language is greatly rewarded. We don't really want to see that here. Okay? Okay. Any other questions about the upcoming writing assignment or midterm? I'll talk more about the midterm on Monday, of course. But. Okay, good. Let's move into the course material. Great, so today we're talking about credibility. This is the last lecture that's going to be on the Grinnell material specifically. And of course, you recall last time we talked about discovery, the discovery process, and how that is potentially or actually permeated by value judgments. In that case, the value judgments we were talking about were this kind of weird class of value judgments, and I don't think most people would have called them values. Like when you say the word values, most people that you ask randomly will think of things like, I love my kids, or taxes are bad, or Jesus is great. Those are the kind of values that most people think of when you say values. In the discovery process lecture on Monday, we were talking about values in terms of the problem of noticing, like figuring out what's important or relevant or interesting. So it was a weird kind of values. And furthermore, it was just about, so you can see here the discovery process is between the individual scientist and the world. So it's kind of values as they act on individuals or within individuals. Today, we're going to move to the credibility process, which is the sort of social side of the scientific process. And the values that we're going to be talking about are the more regular kind of values that you're used to, like what's your political worldview? What do you think of the drug war? That kind of values are going to be the kind of values that are relevant to the credibility process, because now we're talking about the relationship between an individual scientist or a small group of scientists and a broader community, right? The broader social community, who are the ones that decide whether the discovery claim that the individual scientist has come up with is credible enough to make it into journal articles, make it into textbooks, and eventually make it into the kind of popular understanding of how science, what science says is true. So this is the social side of it, and this is the kind of side of it that I think is more counterintuitive to think that values can play a positive role here. Like, I think most people, if you ask them, will tell you that insofar as values are appearing in the sort of social dimension of science, that's a problem, it's a bad thing, and they should really be weeded out. So today I'm going to try to make the case to you using the work mostly of Helen Longino, a philosopher of science, who argues that actually values, social values, non-scientific social values, can play a positive role in this credibility process. So that's the counterintuitive claim that I'm going to try to make a case for you today. Right, so recall, of course, that Grinnell, I'm not going to, sorry, just one last point on this. I take it that I'm not going to sort of belabor the point about like, hey, scientists try to get their work in journals, and those journals have different prestige levels, and that gets you grants and stuff. I won't sort of talk a whole lot about that. This chapter of Grinnell is a lot about that process of trying to get your work out there, trying to get it accepted by a community, and that kind of stuff. I take it that probably you're just already familiar enough with that I don't need to tell you about it. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a step back from the Grinnell material and look at it from a more abstract philosophical dimension to ask about the sort of in-principle questions here. So that's the strategy for today. But we do start from this process that Grinnell talks about of transforming something that Professor Particular, some specific human, claimed, and like, Professor Particular has dozens and dozens of notebooks, handwritten notebooks, recording what happened in a specific room on a specific day under specific circumstances. And those notebooks are not themselves discovery claims. They're not themselves scientific claims exactly. I mean, they're part of the process of science, but they're not the sort of things that make it into textbooks. It's the credibility process that transforms those notebooks first into journal articles, or maybe even before that, maybe into a conference presentation, and then into like a presentation an informal presentation to your scientific peers. Maybe you write an email to somebody who works on a similar process, and then eventually into journal articles and textbooks and on and on and on. So the question for us today is, how does that happen? How does this process of moving from Professor Particular to Professor Anybody happen? Like, what is that process, and how is it justified? And furthermore, how is it possibly permeated by value judgments? And the answer I kind of developed last time, recall that the answer I was trying to present to you on Monday was that the way that a scientific community, assesses the credibility of a claim is through the lens of a paradigm. Right? So a paradigm is an accepted sort of types of experiments and evidence and statistical techniques and that kind of thing. So your discipline has an accepted set of things that it recognizes and say, I know what kind of experiment that is. That's a good kind of experiment. I see what you're doing there. And so when you make a claim about the results of that experiment, I can sort of fit it into my way of seeing things. Right? So a paradigm is a shared collection of knowledge about what's a sensible experiment to do in a discipline. And the trick here is this shared thing, right? So it's not just that you think that an experiment is credible, it's that a community thinks that an experiment is credible. And that's both a really powerful way of keeping bizarre, ungrounded claims out of the literature, but it's also a potential source of problems, right? Because maybe you do have an amazing new discovery and it doesn't fit into the current paradigm. That's a problem for you because people don't have a way of understanding what you're doing. They're not familiar with the way you're going about your experiments. And if it doesn't fit into their standards of evidence, how do you judge? So a paradigm is a set of standards of evidence. And if you present a new, different kind of evidence, they just don't have a kind of ruler to place against it, right? They have no way of assessing whether that's good evidence or not good evidence. And that can be a problem. When you've got something radically new, it can be very difficult to get it through the sort of paradigm process, right? Or the sort of a paradigm is a filter through which you see the world. And if you have something that doesn't fit the filter, that can be very difficult. So the very famous physicist Max Planck says, science advances one funeral at a time. Very pessimistic view of how science goes, but Planck knows what he's talking about. He's one of the guys who first developed quantum mechanics. So you can imagine quantum mechanics is a very, very weird theory in physics by the standards of sort of common sense or by the standards of anybody before the 20th century. They would experience quantum mechanics as profoundly weird, asking us to accept profoundly new ways of thinking and new kind of languages, new models, all kinds of stuff that did not fit the paradigm that came before it. And Planck had quite a bit of trouble getting his radical, revolutionary new ideas accepted by the scientific community. And he had this sort of very pessimistic view of it, which is basically just that new scientists, young new scientists, haven't been sort of thoroughly indoctrinated by the old paradigm yet, and so they're more open than the old scientists. So old scientists are just sort of stuck in their way of seeing things. They've got a pair of binoculars on. They're not switching them out for a new pair. You know, they've got tenure. They don't need your new paradigm. Thank you very much. And basically, you just have to wait for them to retire and or die. And then young new scientists come in, and that's how you get scientific advancement, is that, you know, the humans involved literally get cycled through. So that's pretty pessimistic, and it's indicative of the kind of problems that paradigms bring. So paradigms are essential to the scientific process. You simply can't do without them. You cannot do without a shared community set of solutions to the problem of noticing. Because then if you try to do without it, it's just everyone for themselves. And nobody's going to be on the same page. Nobody's going to be speaking the same language. You can't compare results between two different labs. So you can't do without paradigms. But at the same time, it leaves you in this position where science moves forward one funeral at a time. So this is the kind of double-edged sword of making the credibility process a social process. Right? It's a social process, which means that you have to convince a community, and communities aren't always perfectly rational. I think that's an understatement, actually. Communities are often not perfectly rational, or maybe never perfectly rational. So, here's what you might think of as the standard view about the relationship between individuals and societies, or culture and universality. So when you think of social processes, you think of cultural processes, and cultures are supposed to be these specific, local, you know, like, why is this guy wearing orange? Well, it's a feature of his culture. And there's really not, I mean, there's probably a much more elaborate story to it than that, but like, you can't tell him, well, that's wrong because it's a specific culture, it's a specific color and you shouldn't be wearing something specific. That's not how it works, right? Cultures are these like local specific things that aren't tested against any kind of universal metric. Whereas we think of science as being this thing that produces universal facts, right? Facts that are true wherever you're from and whichever culture you're embedded in, right? It's supposed to be these, I mean, the ideal of science, the thing that science promises us anyway, is this universality. It's not a social thing in the sense of being embedded in a specific culture. It's supposed to be transcultural or something like that. Like, it's supposed to span different cultures. So when I'm saying that, so I'm pointing out that science has got this important social dimension, it might worry you. I propose that you should spend at least one moment worrying about this, that it makes science sound more like a specific culture than this universal truth-generating engine, right? Does that worry, like, at least make sense to you why somebody might be worried about this? Right. Okay. If you're not worried, that's great. But I think this is a fairly standard view that, you know, science is supposed to be this universal thing. Cultures and societies are these specific things that have specific ways of doing things, specific values, specific beliefs, and that they're not really like supposed to be universal, whereas science is supposed to be universal. And so the worry is that, you know, putting social practices into the scientific process, or understanding how social practices are part of the scientific process threatens to make it more like a culture than a universal truth-generating engine. Okay. So this is specifically the view that Longineau, this is Helen Longineau, mid-explaining something to somebody. Helen Longineau argues that the social dimension of science can be a route to objectivity, right? It's specifically the social credibility process that makes it objective in the sense of shared amongst subjects, not objective in the sense of coming out of nowhere, but that it's specifically the social dimension so long as it's arranged just right. So the social dimension has to have certain very specific properties, and then science as a social process can generate agreement, universality. But of course, it can also sometimes interfere, right? So it's not the case that the social dimension of science always increases objectivity. It's that it can under the right conditions. This is a project in what's called social epistemology. So I'd like to distinguish 4 different sort of projects that you could engage in. So Longineau's project is what's called social epistemology, and you should keep that distinct in your head from these 4 other fields of study that you could be interested in. So cognitive psychology is the question of how do people form their beliefs. So what you do in cognitive psychology is you get people in the lab, and then you give them some information, and then you watch what kind of beliefs they form. And you do tests about what kind of information causes them to form what kind of beliefs. And this is a descriptive science, right? It's a science about what do people actually do when they form their beliefs as individuals, typically. There's a social version of this called social psychology, which is the same question but at the level of groups. So instead of asking what makes one person form a belief, you can ask how do beliefs get produced and accepted by social groups, by groups of people. Fairly straightforward. Like, so maybe the dynamics of 10 people in a room trying to decide what's true are different than the dynamics of one person by themselves in front of a computer screen trying to decide what's true. So that's social psychology. Now, those are both descriptive sciences, and we should distinguish them from the project of epistemology. So epistemology is a normative question, or asks normative questions about what should we believe. So what makes a belief justified? And that's different than how beliefs are actually formed. So I'm sorry to tell you, not all of your beliefs are well justified. Some of them you just have for bad reasons. People are like that. But epistemology asks, when should you believe something? So what makes a belief worth believing in? And then, of course, there's a social version of epistemology called social epistemology, which is how do groups justify beliefs? So are there conditions under which a group can say, I'm justified in believing, we are justified in believing this thing? I hope it's fairly clear how that could be related to this process of credibility. This is exactly what, so Longineau's project is social epistemology. She's asking the question, how do you know when a group is going to produce justified beliefs? Okay. So if that's not super clear, here's an example. This is kind of unrelated to what we're going to talk about for the rest of the class, but here's an example of a social epistemic question. So this is a picture of the Large Hadron Collider, the single largest machine ever constructed by humans. It's a circle 27 kilometers across, and they use it to whip particles around at very close to the speed of light, crash them into each other, and see what happens. I'm going to make the bold assertion that there is no human on this planet that knows how all of the parts of this machine work. Okay, it took 10,000 scientists to sort of construct and operate it across hundreds of labs, hundreds of countries, and lots of people know the fundamental physics that it's testing, right? So the basic physics are very common, and probably there are people in this room who have a reasonable grasp of the underlying physics. But there's a lot of parts in this 27 kilometer across machine. It's not machine all the way through, it's just a big circle, but anyway. So there's a lot of parts, and I'm going to assert that there is no human that knows how all of those parts work. I don't think that's all that bold of a claim. It's probably also true of the cell phones in your pockets, that there is no human that knows how each and every part of that thing works. The general principles, but not in detail how it actually works. But clearly it is working. So your phones are working. The Large Hadron Collider is also working reasonably well. They're producing results. The results both match their expectations and defy them in interesting ways. So this is exactly what we were hoping that the Large Hadron Collider would do, produce a bunch of new data about fundamental physics. So if no individual knows how it works, and yet it works, it does what we hope to, what's going on there? And so this is a question for social epistemology. Maybe the group as a whole, so maybe the 10,000 scientists who are working on this thing, as a group, understand how it works. So it's that collective knowledge, perhaps, that justifies the beliefs that we get out of the results of the Large Hadron Collider. This is something that you can disagree about. You can have a lovely debate. So if you're having a debate about this question, you're doing social epistemology. So what justifies the beliefs that we have about, so I believe that the Higgs boson has been discovered. It's a belief I have. I read it in the news. And what justifies that belief is the operation of the Large Hadron Collider. Okay, so who knows how the Large Hadron Collider works? Well, no one person. So what justifies this belief that I have? Maybe it's group knowledge, something like that. Okay, so that's social epistemology. It's fascinating. You should check it out. It's one of these sort of quickly developing fields in philosophy of science. All right, and I'd just like to do 2 quick case studies before I get into the details of Longinot's account. So this is what I just told you was Longino is going to talk about how beliefs are formed by groups and how they're justified on that basis. I haven't told you yet how exactly she thinks that works. The rough version of it is that there's some core scientific values. She calls them constitutive values. And then there's a whole world of contextual values. And that if you get science, if you get the right social arrangement, both of those can work to help science. But before I get into the details of that, I think it would be helpful to just do a couple of case studies. One in which what she calls contextual values or social values played a disastrous role. So this is Lysenkoism. The guy on the left there is Lysenko. And then the other one is rat park experiments. So I'm going to go through both of these, and I'm going to argue that in the first case, in the Lysenkoism case, we have a case of, it's a really obvious case of social values just ruining the scientific process. It just wrecked it, made a very bad problem for science. And in the second case, it's plausible, I'll argue, that social values have actually enhanced the scientific process, that they've given us a new way of seeing something that at least opens up new questions. Okay, so 2 case studies, and then we'll talk about Longino. So this guy is Trofim Lysenko, 1898 to 1976. And I promise this, I did not go looking for a particularly evil looking picture of him. This was the least evil looking picture I could find. There's at least one more where he looks like a vampire. This one, he just looks like a Bond villain or something. So he was born into the lower classes of what was at the time the Soviet Union, and he rose to become the head of Soviet agricultural science. And he's most famous for arguing against what's called Mendelian genetics. So I'll take you through a couple of steps of this story. But so before there was what's called Mendelian inheritance, there was what's called Lamarckian inheritance. So the idea of Lamarck, so this is Lamarck's idea, and he presented a pre-Darwinian version of the theory of evolution. And on his view, according to Lamarck, acquired characteristics can be inherited. So the reason why giraffes have long necks is because they spend all day reaching, stretching up, trying to get the highest leaves on the tree. So that daily stretching makes their necks longer, and then when they have kids, the kids have longer necks. And so whatever you do in your life gets transmitted down to the next generation, and that's how species change over time, is by the sort of individual efforts of the organisms involved, whatever they do. So if you go to the gym every day, your kids will be born more muscular. If you spend all day reading, they'll be more literate, and so Right, so this is Lamarckian inheritance. It's kind of a pre-Darwinian notion of how species evolve. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, very early days of the Soviet Union, so this is after the Russian Revolution, where the communists kicked out the old royal family of Russia, they were pouring money into research on the genetics of food crops. I don't know how much Soviet history you know, but it's really grim, and a lot of people starved to death. So the business of growing food, like millions of people starved to death. So the business of growing food was extremely serious business. This wasn't just like, oh, the farmers are complaining they're not rich enough. This was incredibly serious. They took it incredibly serious, and they were dumping huge amounts of money into scientific research on food crops. And at the time, they were contrasting the bourgeois and racist Lamarckism with the more properly Marxist Mendelism. So the reason they thought that Lamarckism was bourgeois and racist was that it placed the change in the species on the individual. It's kind of rugged individualism about species change. So like, the reason that I grew up healthy and strong is that my parents specifically led virtuous lives, and they led vigorous and good lives. So if you grow up healthy and strong, that's just like, the individual's efforts is what makes them either strong or weak. And then they contrast that with Mendelism. So if you've seen this kind of chart before, this is the kind of like, you get one gene from your mom and one gene from your father, and you have both of them, and your body and mind are some combination of the two. Sometimes one is dominant, sometimes one's recessive, this kind of stuff. This is more or less it's not more or less the current view. It's a really simple model, but it was popular at the time. So this was Mendelism. And the idea is that it doesn't matter what happens to you during your life, like the life that you live has no impact on the inheritance that you give to your kids, right? So if you work out every day, your genes are just exactly the same. Like what your kid gets from you is just exactly the same as if you spend all day on the couch, eating chips or whatever. Like there's no kind of like rugged individualism about it. It's just, you've got genes, they get passed down, and that's it. Okay, so that's Mendelianism. And in the 20s and 30s, the Soviet Union was all about it. The Western world was also all about it, by the way. This was this kind of shared view of how genetics was working. There was still some debate about Darwinism in the 20s and 30s, but this idea of Mendelism started becoming very popular around then. But in the 1930s, Lysenko came on the scene promoting what he called vernalization. So I didn't know that there was two different kinds of grains. Apparently there's two different kinds of grains. Any farmers in the room will know this clearly. There's grains that you can plant in the spring, and then there's grains that you have to plant the winter before, and they have to stay in the ground all winter and then sprout. Who knew? Lysenko knew. So farmers all knew this. Farmers all knew that there were different kinds of grains, and that some could be planted in the winter, and some had to be planted in the winter, and some could be planted in the spring. And what Lysenko claimed is that you could do this process of vernalization, and that meant that you took what was supposed to be a winter grain, what was usually a winter grain, so you had to plant it well ahead of time, and you treat it with cold and moisture, and you could turn a winter grain into a spring grain, so you could just plant it in the spring, no problem. And this was supposed to be a case of the environment changing the properties of the organism, right? So it's the environment, you give the grain specific environmental influences, and then it would change the way it grows and lives, and that furthermore, it was passed down to the next generation, and that if you kept doing this, it would get more and more pronounced. So it's a kind of acquired characteristic that gets passed down. So this is Lysenko going against the Mendelian picture of inheritance. He wasn't exactly a Lamarckist, but he was on his own thing about how inheritance worked. And this was extremely popular with the Soviet kind of government. They loved this idea. At least they loved it initially because it was improving grain production. So Lysenko did not come up with the idea of vernalization. Farmers came up with it Lysenko added on to it the idea that if you kept doing it over and over again, it would continue to improve the performance of the crops. Farmers knew all about this stuff like well before he started talking about it. But this vernalization stuff and what came to be called Lysenkoism fit the Marxist worldview much better than the Mendelian worldview. At least that's the case that Lysenko started making. So the view that the environment shapes us more than genetics was the thing that they liked, because Marxism was all about improving the species by changing the social conditions, right? They weren't suggesting, like the Nazis were suggesting, that we improve the species by killing undesirable people. The Marxists thought the way to go about it was to change the social conditions, and that would improve the species, they thought. Like humanity itself would be improved if we just changed the way goods and services are distributed in society. So they had a very strong environmental focus. They thought, people are a product of their society. Society is not a product of the people, right? So they had this very strong commitment to the environment as the main driver of the properties of living things, and that fit really nicely with Lysenko's stuff about, no, you can change the properties of these grains by doing environmental sort of interventions on them. So his theory, his scientific theory, fit really nicely with this Marxist theory. And again, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the history of the Soviet Union, but they did not take these things lightly. It was not like, hey, you've got your opinion and I've got mine, that's just swell, at all. It was the opposite of that. You could get sent to a Siberian prison camp for saying that you thought this stuff was wrong. You would be thrown in a really unpleasant jail where you could quite conceivably die. And so this is held up as the classic case, or a classic case, where science was just deeply, deeply compromised by a political worldview, and that political worldview was just handed down and said, okay, this guy is saying the right thing. Anybody who disagrees with him is going to the gulag. Called it the gulag. That was like where they sent people who dared to disagree with anything that the party was saying. So this is a really clear case, in my opinion, of contextual non-scientific values that are not sort of part of the core of science, just running like a bulldozer over this scientific process. Yeah, so that's Lysenkoism. It's a classic case, you should know it, and it's supposed to be, the point of showing you this was just to really vividly illustrate the point that science is not just automatically independent of society. If you live in the Soviet police state, where nobody's allowed to disagree with whatever the party says, and furthermore, the party is telling you which scientific theory is right, then the scientific process cannot proceed the way it ought to, right? You're not going to get reliable results. Under the conditions where the government is telling you what the truth is about an open scientific question, you're just not going to get a reliable credibility process. I don't think that's controversial at all. I think everybody should look at this and go, yeah, that's terrible, this didn't work at all. The current consensus in biology, by the way, is somewhere in between environment and genetics. So we have a much more dynamic view of the genome now. So the genome, it turns out to be like not just a computer program, but more like a pipe organ with 30,000 keys that can play a variety of different tunes according to the environment. So we're somewhere in between those two views now, much more sophisticated than either of them. But the point is not what's true. The point is that the process of research was not properly sensitive to criticism or facts pushing back against the view being handed down. All right. Okay, enough of Lysenkoism and this scary looking man. Okay, so the other case study that I'd like to look at just quickly is a case, I'm going to propose this as a case of values helping. This is much more controversial because the questions that they're debating are just wide open still, but it's a really interesting case where at least these experiments presented a new set of questions that are open questions. The debate rages on about whether they definitively showed what they meant to show, but I think it's a really interesting case about how things that you think in the rest of your life can be helpful for understanding something from a new way of thinking. So these are the famous rat park. Hands up, anybody's heard of this before, rat park experiments? Oh, wonderful, I'm so happy. Maybe, okay. If you might recognize it more as I get into it, but right, so for most of the 20th century, this is what a psychology lab looked like. Those are little bare steel cages. There's nothing in them except a rat, and the rat was the primary object of psychological research. So we did mostly tons and tons of research on rats. They're easy to breed, they're easy to keep, but they would keep them in these really brutal little cages. And so they would do all kinds of experiments, but one of the rat park example is specifically about addictions research. So the standard model for addictions research under this paradigm, so this way of thinking about what experiments are meaningful, what standards of evidence are the right ones, the standard addictions experiment that they would do under this paradigm would be to take a rat in one of these bare steel cages, totally socially isolated, and put a line directly into his jugular vein and have a little lever in the cage. And if the rat pushes the lever, it gets drugs injected directly into its bloodstream. So like heroin or cocaine or morphine, press the lever and you get a shot of heroin. Now, if you look at this from the rat's perspective, you should find it totally unsurprising that they were really fond of heroin under those conditions. If you're in a bare steel cage and there's nothing that you can affect in your environment other than pressing a lever to get some hard drugs, I would press that lever all day long, right? I mean, you have a miserable experience, and all you can do is relieve your pain somewhat by the one thing that they're letting you do, and furthermore, that thing is direct intravenous heroin. Well, they loved their heroin, and if you took it away, they got really upset. And furthermore, they would go to great lengths. So if you train them up, they have to do a task to get the heroin, they will do that task until their little nails were worn down to nubs. Like they would do anything to get it, right? And this was the basis of addictions research for decades. This was the model, this was the experimental model, and the conclusion from this was, if you let people have drugs, they will get terribly, terribly addicted to them, right? That was the conclusion. So, under this paradigm, a bunch of things are deemed to be irrelevant. For example, the social life of the rats is deemed to be irrelevant. You put them in a bare steel cage. Their environment is deemed to be basically irrelevant. There's nothing in the cage for them to do or to move around or anything. So all of the things that make a life worth living for a human were sort of taken out of this experimental context as irrelevant factors. And at the same time, there was a drug war raging in our society. So thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were being sent to jail for the crime of possessing drugs, on the basis that these drugs are so addictive that they will override anything that you care about, based on this addictions research. The addictions research says these drugs are horribly, horribly addictive. Therefore, it's imperative that we keep them out of hands of people because a normal, healthy person will be crippled by addiction if we let them have some cocaine or some heroin. This was the inference. Okay. Sometime in the 70s, and I believe it got published in the 80s, a group of Canadian psych researchers started asking whether these assumptions about relevance and irrelevance were justified. And they did what they called the rat park experiment. So instead of having them in bare steel cages and isolated, they would have rats. So first they would get them addicted to heroin, or cocaine or something. So they would get them addicted to some hard drug, but then they would release them into what they called this rat heaven. So There's places for them to hide. There's a bunch of rats all socially interacting. So rats are, in nature, rats are highly social animals, just like humans are. If you isolate a human, that's considered torture by like most conventions. So extreme isolation is considered a form of torture. Rats are also very social animals. They really, really like interacting with other rats, playing with them, fighting with them, having sex with them. They had places to explore. They could run around. They could interact. They could hide. Kind of the things that make up a basic rat life. And if you released a rat that's already addicted to a hard drug into this environment and gave them the option of either having water laced with the drug or not laced with the drug, they would mostly become unaddicted, right? They would slowly wean themselves off of the drug. Because, for example, being high on heroin makes it harder to interact socially. So these rats apparently found it more valuable. I mean, this is the inference, but these rats what you can observe is they would use far, far less drugs than rats in the socially isolated steel cage. That was the robust result of this. They were much less likely. Some rats, some percentage of the rats, would still be very interested in drinking the drug-laced water, but most of them probably found the taste of it, so they were drinking this, and it was very bitter, so they didn't like the taste. They didn't like being inebriated to the point where they couldn't interact with other rats. Again, these are inferences. All they observed was how much they drank. So this is a controversial result. Not everybody agrees that this result is replicable, that this result is reliable. So this has not finished the credibility process yet. I want to warn you about that. However, people in addictions research do not currently assume, as we used to assume, that the intrinsic property of the drug is the only thing that matters, right? So people, when we're doing rehab for people who are addicted to drugs, for example, the environment in which they're doing the rehab is considered very important currently. So the paradigm that was dominant has at least opened up a little to new questions, new kinds of questions about what's relevant to either being addicted or not addicted to a drug. And this opens up the possibility of thinking about addiction in terms of like people just having, so this is, again, so be very careful about this. This is not a direct result of this research, but this is the hypothesis that is taken to support. The hypothesis is people aren't addicted to drugs because of the intrinsic properties of the drugs. People are addicted to drugs because they've had some intolerable either past trauma or current situation in their lives, and drugs are a good strategy for coping with those feelings. So your life has become intolerable in some way. If a drug can make it at least somewhat tolerable, you will use that drug all day long. But that's not to say that the problem is the drug. The problem is that you got something in your life that you can't deal with. So changing the thing in your life, like extreme social isolation or being considered an extremely low status person in society, or being cut, or like blocked out of having a decent job and all of the stuff that people like to have. So maybe that's the place to intervene, not waging a drug war. That's the hypothesis. Again, this is not, don't take this to the bank. This is not like mRNA mediates between DNA and protein. Take that one to the bank. You can use that fact anywhere you want to use it as a reliable textbook scientific fact. This one is still very much open to debate, and it's very much the kind of fact that you should worry about because it involves human biology and society, which is the most complex domain that you could be dealing with. But so this is potentially, I would like to argue, a case in which, we already talked about all that, so a case in which these people the scientists involved were horrified by the drug war. Right? They were horrified by the way that their society was treating drug addicts. And that's a kind of extra scientific value, isn't it? That's not a value, that's not like accuracy or simplicity or coherence. That's not a core scientific value. It's a social value. And it's not a social value that everybody shares. Like some people do think that drugs are just a sin or like a terrible thing to do to your body. And that's also an extra scientific value. What happened was that people with a different set of extra scientific contextual values brought those values to bear on the research questions that they were asking, and those extra scientific values opened up a new way of thinking and seeing the problem. I particularly like the combination of these two case studies because it's the same set of values that in one case ruined the scientific process and in the other at least potentially helped it. So it's the influence of the environment. So in Lysenkoism, the belief was so strong that the environment was the thing doing all the work that it ruined the scientific process. In this case, it was an insufficient amount of belief in the causal relevance of the environment that was causing the problem. And it's solved by being increasingly sensitive to how the environment influences a living thing. So it's the same values, essentially, in the very rough outline, but with quite dramatically different effects on how they affected the scientific project. So the question for the second half of this lecture is, under what conditions do values play a positive role, and under what conditions do they play a detrimental role? So that was a couple of case studies, and I just want you to keep them in mind as we're talking about Longinus stuff as examples of how the different ways in which values can influence the credibility process. By the way, I put one chapter from Longinus' book on the blackboard. It's specifically marked as optional reading, at least partly because philosophers have a really dense style of writing that if you're not used to, it's impenetrable. Longinus is pretty good as far as philosophers go, but it's still significantly less easy to read than Grinnell. So it's an optional reading, which means that it is not testable. The material just in that reading is not going to appear on the midterm or the exam. The stuff that I'm about to tell you is testable. I'm going to talk about Longinus. So the stuff I'm about to present in lecture is testable, but just the reading itself is not. The mandatory reading for this week was Grinnell, of course. So this is optional. It's in the folder for this week. I've also put up the reading for next Monday, which is hacking on social construction. So that's there for you whenever you want to get going on it. All right. So Helen Longino presents this picture of the social epistemology of science. That is, how scientists generate beliefs that are justified as groups. And it's kind of, I think this is from 1990. It's come to be an incredibly important perspective in philosophy of science. We've really a lot of people have shifted into seeing this as a central way of seeing how science generates relatively objective facts. And it's essentially, I would argue, the same picture that Grinnell is arguing. That's why I'm shifting to this. Grinnell is basically presenting you with a picture of how objectivity is generated through the right kind of social arrangement, and Longino is going to make the same basic argument. She says, there are two kinds of values that we should pay attention to, which I mentioned already, but let's talk about them directly. Contextual values and constitutive values. So the contextual values are the kind of things that you usually think of as values. I love my family, taxes are bad, that kind of extra scientific values. The things that were on the Rokeach Value Survey was pretty much all contextual values. So these are the things about which scientists can differ, and even scientists within a research group. So you might have a left-winger and a right-winger in the same research group. And that's okay so long as everybody's got the same constitutive values. These are the values without which you don't get science. So if you got one person in your research group that doesn't care about the truth, your research group is not going to work properly. They're like, it's okay to just make up data, that's fine. I don't value the truth at all. Well, that's a constitutive value of science, and they've kind of given up on the idea of doing science. So ideas like accuracy, the idea that you should present consistent ideas, that you should try to, if you have one belief over here and another belief over there, you should try to make them cohere with each other and not just think A and not A at the same time. That you should be responsive to evidence, that you should be honest and all this stuff. So these are the basic constitutive values of science, and they form the core around which the contextual values can differ. Everybody's got to be on the same page in terms of the constitutive values, though. If you don't believe in these things, you kind of don't believe that you're kind of not doing science anymore. Right. So she has us consider two possible ways of viewing this, both of which she thinks are wrong, by the way. She thinks both of these theses are incorrect. So the autonomy thesis says science is not affected by contextual values at all. I hope that that was sufficiently refuted for you by the Lysenkoism case. It was a case of somebody trying to do science, but the contextual values interfered in a really serious way. So the autonomy thesis is just not credible, at least not for all of science. And then there's the integrity thesis, which is much more credible. I mean, and I think this is probably how most people think about it. The integrity thesis says constitutive values, the values that are central to science, weed out or cancel out or filter out the contextual values. So if there's somebody in your research group that believes taxation is theft, and another person who believes that taxation is the basis of a social contract, then according to the integrity thesis, it's the job of the constitutive values of science to just sort of cancel those out. And so we cancel out the contextual values. They play no role in the actual scientific process because everybody's committed to the truth and to accurately representing it and all that stuff. So she thinks this, I think this is a much more plausible way of thinking about it. If this is your way of thinking about science, that's a fairly reasonable approach. But Longino is going to go even further than that. She wants to say not only are contextual values present, so no to the autonomy thesis, they're also not inactive or they're not canceled out in good scientific research. So she also rejects the integrity thesis. Her thesis, Longino's thesis, is that both contextual and constitutive values play a role in good scientific practice. They also play a role in bad scientific practice. It's not that these guarantee, the presence of these values does not guarantee that science is working. However, it's not the case that good science is value-free. This is her kind of conceptual innovation. Okay. She talks about critical contextual empiricism. This is the view that she advances in her book, The Social Dimension of Science. Oh, sorry. What's it called? Science is Social Knowledge. So in Science is Social Knowledge, she tries to argue for critical contextual empiricism. Break that down. So empiricism is just the view that scientific knowledge is mainly founded on experience, evidence, observations, data, that kind of thing. So that's the main driver of scientific research. This is true. So long as you don't call things like math and logic science, then this seems to me sort of obviously true. It's contextual because, she says, scientific knowledge is in principle open to contextual values. So that's even the contextual values can play a role in scientific theorizing, but it's also critical in the sense that the best science is self-reflective about the role of values, criticizing its own assumptions. So this critical bit is the crucial bit for her. And this is, your empiricism might be contextual, but if it's not critical, then you're not going to have good science. So under what conditions, the question then is, under what conditions is science self-reflective and able to criticize its own assumptions? Right? And what she says is there has to be the potential for what's called transformative criticism. So contextual values enhance science, she claims, under very specific circumstances. And those circumstances are when transformative criticism can take place. So it must be possible for all of the parties in the conversation to both give and receive criticism and to listen to that criticism and take it seriously and evaluate it seriously. So this is what failed in the Lysenkoism example. Right? This was not the case. In a police state and in Soviet Russia, it is not possible to criticize the party or to criticize the dominant sort of power structure. They will kill you and your family and anybody you talk to. Right? This was a society in which it was impossible to offer transformative criticism. Our society, I would like to claim, is substantially more open than Soviet Russia was to that kind of criticism. So you can say things about Justin Trudeau, and they won't put a bag over your head and drag you off in the night, yet. Currently, anyway. So Essentially, this has to be true not just in society in general, but in the research process itself, right? So in the process of taking discovery claims and trying to transform them into credible scientific discoveries, sort of like credible scientific textbook facts, transformative criticism has to be possible, where people with different contextual values, different ways of seeing the world, can talk to each other and be listened to by each other. Which is not to say that the people involved have to just believe what somebody else is saying, right? So Dan Dennett has this lovely line. You say, you should have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. So transformative criticism is not where you say, well, I think it's this way, and I have to say, well, I guess it's that way. It's not the conditions for transformative criticism are not that everybody has to believe what everybody else says about the world. The conditions for transformative criticism are everybody's at least listening and taking seriously and considering the perspectives of people with different contextual values than them. So this is how Rat Park got to be a study, and furthermore, how it got to sort of make its way into at least the scope of the discussion, is that people with a different set of values were allowed to run their experiment and present their results, and people were allowed to criticize those results. So the critics had to listen to the Rat Park researchers, and the researchers had to listen to the critics. Those are the conditions under which you have transformative criticism, where they're taking on board the good parts of the criticism that they're hearing, and they're responding to it. This kind of sensitivity to criticism, but it's not that you're bowled over by criticism, but you're at least sensitive to it. Now, this openness to dialogue runs counter to what I like to call the Agent Kay Thesis. Nobody else calls it, by the way, so if you go and talk to somebody about this, they will have no idea what you're talking about. But from Men in Black, Agent Kay drops this line. He says, "A person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals." So the idea is that if you want somebody at their maximum level of rationality and intelligence, you get them alone. But if you get people in a group, their average IQ suddenly drops. This is it's an old Freudian idea, actually, so that when you have a riot or something like that, any individual member of the riot maybe wouldn't have decided to smash those windows and burn down those buildings. But when you get people excited in a group, suddenly their ability to regulate themselves is kind of transferred onto the group rather than in their individuality. So the basic cynical idea here is that groups are dumb and people are smart. Even a group of smart people can be dumb is the argument. It's not your argument. It's a claim. And it runs directly contrary to this idea that how we become smart is by entering into these social relations, right? So this is the exact opposite of Longino's thesis. So Longino says the way that we get good science that's potentially objective and universal, is by forming groups, forming social circles who are capable of having transformative criticisms of each other. And this kind of runs against this fairly common view of how rationality works, is that individuals are rational, but groups are, they're bowled over by group opinion. So if one really attractive member of a group says something with a confident voice, everybody else is like, yeah. And they don't even think about it. They just sort of let the thinking process be taken over by whoever is the de facto leader of the group that day. So that's a danger, but I would like to briefly make the argument to you that there's also lots of dangers of individuals thinking on their own terms. So one of the really robust results of psychology from the last couple of decades is that people as individuals are riddled with cognitive biases. So you have the impression that you're reasoning in a perfectly rational way, but actually if you test people and compare them against sort of reasonably objective standards about what good reasoning is, we all do badly as individuals. So we have these biases. I'll just do two really quickly. There's dozens and dozens of these things, but confirmation bias. So people are more likely to pay attention to data which supports their opinions. So if you read two newspaper articles, one of them supports your political view, and one of them is kind of evidence against it, the one that supports your view will shine like a light. You'll remember it longer. You'll think it's more important and more interesting, and you'll kind of ignore the one that it goes against your way of seeing. And this is a really robust result from individual psychology, from cognitive psychology. People do this. You'll lock in on the data that confirms your worldview and kind of ignore or minimize data that refutes it. So you as an individual have this bias in your, me too, like it's all of us. Probably this is more the kind of thing where it's a divergence between what's more likely to have you survive and reproduce versus what's more likely to have you have all true beliefs. So if evolution is shaping the way that we reason, it's going to pick, and if in any case where there's a difference between your likelihood of what makes you more likely to just have kids who will have kids and what makes you likely to have all true beliefs, it's going to pick the have kids who have kids thing. And this is probably something like that. So, like if you have 100 people and some of them are just full of confidence and like self-assurance, and some of them are full of self-doubt, apparently in our evolutionary past, it was the ones who were full of confidence who made it more often than the ones who were full of self-doubt. And this is also, by the way, why depressed people can be more rational than non-depressed people, because depressed people's hypothesis is that they are terrible people who are wrong about everything. And if you believe that, if that's your hypothesis, then you are free to interpret all of the data kind of on equal basis, whereas people who are not depressed are less likely to do that. They're likely to be just very confident in their views and their beliefs and think, I'm great, and only pay attention to the stuff that proves that I'm great. Right. Okay, so that's confirmation bias. We'll just do one more quickly. Belief bias, so people tend to overestimate the strength of arguments when they believe the conclusion. So here's an argument. All actors are vain. Tom Cruise is an actor, or is vain, therefore Tom Cruise is an actor. Now, is that a good argument? No, it's a terrible argument. This is a classic fallacy. It's a classic error in argument. Say, all x's are y. This person is a y, therefore they're an x. It's called affirming the consequent. Right? This is not a good argument. It's a terrible argument. But it probably looks like a good argument because you believe all of these three things. Or at least they're all plausible. Maybe you don't believe all actors are vain, but like, they are, so. No, so the fact that you believe the premises and the conclusion makes it more likely that you'll judge this to be a good argument. We try to come. So what's a one of this form that you wouldn't believe? So all dogs have hair. I have hair, therefore I'm a dog. Now that's obviously I hope that's more obviously a bad argument than this one, because that would demonstrate confirmation bias or belief bias. So your ability to assess this argument that obviously has a false conclusion is much greater than your ability to assess this one that has not an obviously false conclusion. So together, belief bias and confirmation bias, you're more likely to believe the premises that you like. Furthermore, you're more likely to assess the arguments that you like to be good ones. Together, and along with the dozens and dozens of other cognitive biases that psychology has shown that people are like constantly riddled with, show that actually individuals are not rational. Individuals are not smart, as it were. We are all just doing our very best with the extremely limited information and brain power that we have available. Like, we're working with chimpanzee brains with a couple of pounds of meat slapped on it. Like, as individuals, we are not that bright, frankly. This is the result of sort of cognitive psychology of the 20th century and 21st century. We're much, much less rational than we would have assumed, or that we did assume before this research, as individuals. Now, what happens when you have a bunch of people with different views? Well, you get transformative criticism, right? So I have a belief bias. I have a confirmation bias about my opinion. You have a belief bias. You have a confirmation bias about your opinion. But if we can get into a serious conversation where I'm listening to you and you're listening to me, we can maybe get past those biases, right? We can leverage the difference between us into some third perspective that we can both agree on, potentially. And this is not just about the beliefs that we have, it's furthermore about the perspectives that we bring to bear on the world. So that was the point of the Rat Park experiment. It's not just about the specific beliefs that you have, it's not just about the specific arguments that you accept, it's about who's got which is the right framework to bring to bear on the world. And if we have different contextual values, we might bring different frameworks to bear. And you might be able to see things that were invisible to me because of my confirmation bias and because of my belief bias. And if I can manage to suppress my urge to think that I'm awesome for 2 seconds and listen to criticism of my way of being and thinking, then maybe I can get beyond my specific parochial way of thinking and into a slightly more universal perspective. And this is, according to Longino, how science works, right? We enter into these social arrangements in which you can criticize me and I can criticize you, and that elevates both of us beyond anything that we could have seen from our local perspective. Yeah, question?
What if you had two people in a discussion?
Yeah.
And then one was right and the other was wrong? So they criticized the right one.
Yeah.
And then they started to believe they were wrong. So now they both believe in the wrong argument.
Yeah.
So now that they're in a group, they've actually, the smart ones become dumber.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a serious question. Like it's a serious. So to repeat for the recording, what happens when one person's right and one person's wrong, and they get into this transformative criticism, and the right person thinks that they're less right, and the wrong person thinks that they're less wrong? Do you have a response to this? Yeah.
Right. So like, it's a learning process, maybe.
Good. So the response, again, for the recording, the response is sort of maybe the right person wasn't all that right. Maybe they're not right from a transcendental perspective. I think that's one configuration. So on questions where, that's one possibility. On questions where, yeah, maybe there's just not one right answer, and that even the right person isn't as right as they thought they were. I think that there are questions about which there are, given a way of seeing, so once you've got a way of seeing in place, then there are just right and wrong answers about it. So I think the scenario that you describe is a possible situation. But that's why, so the hope is that that's why we have a broader scientific community. So the scenario you gave was just two people, one who's definitely right, one who's definitely wrong, and the right one's confidence gets decreased and the wrong one's confidence gets increased. That's why they should both go talk to a larger circle and sort of see what everybody else thinks and continue this conversation. So it's got to be a cyclical process. So it could be the case that in some situations the group does not get the answer right. I'm not going to tell you that, I'm certainly not going to tell you that individuals are always wrong and groups are always right. That's just not true. It's certainly not true all of the time. What you do is increase your odds, right? So you can increase your odds by talking to a broader and broader group of people. And that's how it works in scientific disciplines. Like first you present at your super local conference, and then you put it in a journal, and then other people that are unrelated start weighing in, and the circle gets broader and broader. And essentially if everybody's wrong, like if you're the only person in the world who has the truth and everybody else is wrong, science is not going to vindicate you. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. But hopefully, in cases where their transformative criticism is possible, the true beliefs get sort of, or the truer beliefs are the ones that win out over the long run. So what you described as a case in a short run, the true belief didn't win, but hopefully, and so far it seems to be working okay, the long run is that the more true your belief is, the more universally applicable it is, the more likely it is to survive over time. So you really have to rely on the long run and on big groups. But yeah, so what I do think that the scenario you describe is a possible thing that happens sometimes, where just one person is just right. Like maybe Max Planck was like, hey, quantum mechanics, this is great. And 10 people sat in a circle and go, Max, you're talking crazy talk. This doesn't make any sense. And maybe Max's confidence was decreased in that exchange. But over the long run, his perspective proved to be worthwhile across perspectives, across contexts. And so that's the one that sort of eventually became the consensus. And I don't want to tell you that this process is guaranteed to be successful in every case. It is not guaranteed to be successful in every case. This is not an algorithm, right? This is not a process that always works. It's a process that works more often than it doesn't work. It's the best process we've ever come up with. And that's about all you can say about it, I would think. Like, it's the best you can hope for, is that over the long run and on average, it's better than not doing science. Sorry, we're these tiny, finite little beings exploring a apparently infinite universe with vastly more features than we could possibly even look at, never mind consider. So I think that's the best you can hope for. Okay. So, a couple of real quick historical examples. So, about social organization and what has to be the case for transformative criticism to be possible. Historians of science often point to the establishment of what's called the Royal Society of London as one of the kind of founding points of what's considered modern science. So tons of exploration of the natural world before this. Tons and tons of exploration of the natural world. Lots of facts were being generated. Lots of interesting sort of techniques were being developed. You know, we knew how to distill things. We knew how to make steel. We knew all kinds of facts about the world. But what we didn't have in place, or what nobody had kind of developed yet, was the peer review process, the credibility process. And this is taken to be one of the early attempts to establish a credibility process. So Newton was one of the sort of central members of this, so that's about the time and place that we're talking about. And the motto was nullus in verba, which basically means don't take anyone's word on it. So don't take the testimony of old dead philosophers as evidence. That's not what's important here. It's experiment that's really important. If somebody tells you something is true, go test it for yourself. And the important thing about the Royal Society in this context was its ideal of classlessness, not in the sense that they were crude and rude, but in the sense that the ideal was that it wasn't the case that richer and higher up on the social hierarchy people had more say than people from lower on the social hierarchy. So that was the idea. Like, the main idea was people from humble families had just as much say in what's true or what's reasonable in the Royal Society as people from the elite circles, right? So if you're a duke or you're a noble person, that doesn't get you any more credibility for the Royal Society than if you're from a poor family and you somehow managed to get through your education. That was the idea. It was still all reasonably affluent men from basically the upper half of society at the very least. Like, there's very few people that started working in the fields and then got to participate in the Royal Society. So it's not like it was wide open and anybody could walk in the door and contribute, but at least the idea of sharing results and the idea that somebody from low on the social hierarchy could criticize somebody high on the social hierarchy was developed as an ideal. And I think we've moved a long way from the Royal Society. This is like the 1600s. So now your family doesn't have to be from anywhere in particular in order for you to contribute to the scientific project, do they? Like, you don't have to have a specific lineage or name or anything like that. So long as you've got the right academic credentials, you're welcome to participate in the project. More or less. We're getting there anyway. So we're moving towards this ideal, hopefully, of having the capacity for criticism be decoupled from your social rank. Right? In your sort of social economic place in society is being decoupled from people listening to your ideas. And that's the conditions under which transformative criticism can take place. And I think it's not a coincidence that after this kind of setup started being, developed in science, science took off like a rocket after this. Like, the development of science rapidly increased when we started to institute this ideal of people being able to criticize other people without fear or favor. Now, contrast that to how science worked before. So compare the Royal Society with Galileo's situation. A couple hundred years before, Galileo was basically like a science entertainer. So his paycheck came from the richest family in Europe, the Medicis, as well as the sort of church was one of his patrons. And what you would do, so this is Galileo at the court of Isabella, what Galileo would do is come to court where there's the extremely rich, extremely powerful person sitting there and a bunch of their friends all sort of gathered round, and you'd give them some beautiful scientific fact. You'd say, I have discovered the moons of Jupiter. They're amazing, come see. And whether you got your contract renewed, essentially, like whether they would keep giving you money, was not dependent on the decision of like other scientists. So they wouldn't gather around a whole bunch of other scientists and say, hey, what is this Galileo's guy's work up to? Like, is this high quality work or not? It would be the rich people. It would be the Medicis or the Pope or the Bishop who would say, yeah, that was fun. I like that. Great, another couple thousand florins for you. Right? So this is not what we have today. It's certainly not what they had in the Royal Society, where the person who decides the direction of the research and the person who's the audience for the research are directly tied to your social and economic standing. Right? So the richer you are, the more of an influence you get to have over who gets to, like, there'd be, Galileo would do his song and dance about, here's the science I've discovered. And then other people would do the same thing. And if your thing was more entertaining and more like credible to those extremely rich and powerful people, they would give you money and not the other guy. And so this is the organization that was basically common throughout the history of science before the 1700s or so, 1700s. Like, it would be either rich, idle people, doing experiments themselves because they had the time and money, or it would be the ultra rich paying somebody to do research because they thought it was fun and interesting. And you had to tailor it to be fun and interesting for them. And if it wasn't fun and interesting, like, that was the kind of the ideal of courtly life. You'd have a poet and then a singer and then Galileo. And you would have to come in and be like a fun entertainer and also tell them something that they can believe. So this is not a situation where you get to have transformative criticism, right? Galileo does not get to come in there and say, hey, you're wrong, Medicis. You have it all wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. Yeah, question?
Have things really changed? Doesn't science work like this still?
Have things really changed? Doesn't science work like this still? Well, to what degree and to what extent, I guess.
Like, when you want money, when you want investments, when you want grants,
Yeah.
you have to appease the people who you're asking for money.
Absolutely. So you have to apply for grants and stuff. But who sits on the board of those decisions? So if you're applying for an NSERC, which is a big grant that scientists compete for, the people who decide whether your grant gets granted or not are another group of scientists. It's not that your elected officials, or it's not the ultra rich sitting on the board to decide who gets funding or not. It's other scientists. Now, this is not an idle question. This is a serious question that you're asking, because who decides which granting agencies get money to give out? Well, that's the government. So there are, and rich patrons as well. So it's not the case that we are completely divorced. So you make a serious point here, where it is not the case that we're currently in a situation where we have a perfect opportunity for transformative criticism. It is not the case that we've completely divorced who gets listened to and what your social and economic standing is. They are not completely decoupled. And being able to make an entertaining and interesting case for your research is still a factor in whether you get grant money. However, I would strongly contrast, so these things come in a wide variety of degrees, and there is great progress yet to be made on decoupling these things. However, we're in a vastly different situation than Galileo was, where it was a direct appeal to people, to non-scientists, to people who are not engaged in the research project and who have totally, like, it was just their contextual values that was making the decisions about who gets the money to continue the research, which is really, really different, I would suggest. And furthermore, they didn't have the kind of like value neutral ideal that we are currently aiming at. So we don't satisfy this ideal. I would agree fully. It is not the case that we satisfy the like anybody from any part of society can contribute to the scientific process and expect their voices to be heard equally. Especially the case that you have to have made it through the academic process, the academic credibility process. If you don't have a PhD, your voice is far, far less, like it's almost impossible to get your voice heard within the scientific community. If you haven't been through the academic process and you need to be able to pay your way through a lot of that, you need to be able to like not be working for 4 or 5 years to get your undergrad, to get into grad school. Furthermore, you have to have the right kind of like, there's all kinds of filters on who gets through grad school, so you have to speak right, you have to have the right kind of manners, you have to have all these things in place which are not independent from social class, background, culture, and any of that stuff. So I don't want to argue that we're in this position where science is just unrelated to these contextual values in terms of who gets a voice. However, we're not singing and dancing for the Medicis either. We're not in a situation where it's just totally arbitrary. But it is a really good question because there's no arrow of history here. There's no guarantee that we're rolling steadily towards a more and more value-free ideal. And I think politics south of the border currently makes me worry that science is being repoliticized in a serious way. So the cuts to climate science research, for example, seems to me rich and powerful people imposing their opinions about what research should be done in a very serious and maybe worrying way. So we're cutting off the potential for transformative criticism. People who don't want to hear that carbon dioxide might be a danger to the planet are saying, well, I don't want to hear that anymore, so you're not going to get any more money to pursue that question. So that would be a case where we are singing and dancing for the Medicis. So it's not an ancient worry. It is not an irrelevant worry. But it's not the case that we are just exactly where we were 400 years ago either. Yeah. Okay. So that was Grinnell, the credibility process related to the discovery process. The idea is values play a role in the discovery process via the problem of noticing. Values play a role in the credibility process via paradigms and via who gets money, who gets funding. And both Longino and Grinnell argue that what makes science capable of producing perspective independent views or intersubjectively accessible views is the right kind of social organization. You need a society that's sufficiently open so that you can criticize the dominant ways of thinking, and you need a society that's actually open to the criticism in the sense of responding to it. So you can't do good science in Soviet Russia. You also need your scientific community itself to be organized such that you can give and receive criticism. But if you have those things, then the fact that we all come to the world with various things that we think are important, and those things can be different, can be a positive contributor to the scientific process. Okay, that's it for today. Next time, read Hacking. It's on the blackboard now, and we'll talk about social construction.